How often does this happen to you? You start up a new project just to find out that you've got to spend the next hour of your life rearranging things just to make it the way you want it. And that's before you can start making your game fun. Well, quit doing that and let me show you what I do to make starting a new project easy. If you haven't done so already, head on over to the Discord and join in the conversation. This project and many more moving forward will be available to my patrons who are level programmer or higher. Links for both are in the description. Thank you to my current patrons for your generosity. Let's face it, most of us don't currently work for a game studio and instead are learning how to make our own games. This means that during this journey, we will start many different projects. What I've done here is I've created my own custom starter template project that has all of the most common assets and blueprints that I use when starting a new project. What this allows me to do is every time I start a new project, I open up my custom starter template, find the assets I need, then I migrate over to my new project. In this particular template, I have 3 different variations of a player blueprint and controller all arranged in a file structure that makes sense to me, so when I migrate it over, it will conform to this file structure. Migrating also is smart enough to include every other asset that is attached to a particular asset, such as its materials and animations. What I've done is not much more than the default code provided by Epic in their default templates, except I've moved the player movement over to a player controller and removed all the extra stuff I don't need or want, such as the touch inputs and VR settings. The code I have in this example is very basic, but that's really the key to this type of system. Only include the functionality that you would commonly use in a particular project type. You may have also noticed that I have included the starter content in this template as well. Why include this very large amount of assets to every project when in reality you will only use a couple things while prototyping? Here you can simply select the assets you want to use and migrate them over to your project. So what can you put in your starter template project? Well, anything you want really. However, I suggest keeping whatever you put here as generic as possible so you don't find yourself having to delete or rewrite some of the code you have already entered. That would defeat the purpose of this template project. Some other things you can include is a default test map that you can migrate over to help you prototype and test your new game. Maybe include a landscape and a master auto material that looks good enough to use in virtually any project. If you haven't seen the auto landscape done by the Unreal Sensei, then I highly recommend you go check it out. He gives it to you for free. Link is in the description. Make sure that if you grab this auto landscape, get it from his recent 5-hour-long video that is his UE5 starter course. He provides a download that not only includes the updated version of his auto landscape, but includes some other nice assets as well. So go check it out and make sure that you say thank you for his hard work. As you're aware, Epic gives away free marketplace content every month. Most of it's pretty good stuff, but there's also a lot of stuff that only has a few assets that relate to you and your style. Feel free to go into those projects and migrate any assets over that you want in your starter template. Again, try to keep things minimal and include only things you think you would use or need when starting a new project. Simplicity is the key. You can always add more content to your project without adding it directly to your starter template. Let's go ahead and start a new project that will become our starting template. What I've got here is just the default third-person template with starter content enabled. Before we begin organizing and changing things up to suit our needs, let's go ahead and import the first-person character into this project. Go ahead and head back out, and let's start a new project with the first-person template. You can go ahead and name this project anything you want. This is going to be deleted after we're done migrating what we need from it. I'm going to go ahead and just name mine Delete Me. There's no need to have the starter content, so go ahead and make sure this is unchecked and click Create. Now that the project is open, let's migrate over the things we need from this project. For me, all I really care about is the default character blueprint, the skeleton, and the default animations. If you want the gun in your starter template, then migrate that over too, but for me, I would just end up adding my own animations and weapons to the skeleton. So the gun here is nothing more than a proof of concept, so I don't need it in mind, but you do what's best for you. Open the content drawer, find the first person character blueprint, right click it, and under Asset Actions, choose to migrate it. When the new screen pops open, it will display everything that is currently tied to this character blueprint, including the animations, skeleton mesh, materials, and textures. Some things you can opt out of migrating, but as a general rule, you should migrate most things attached to it, then delete the unwanted things in the new project after migration. However, double check this list and make sure everything is correct. Sometimes Epic tries to force extra things on you like extra meshes and characters, which I'll explain later. For now, this looks correct, so select OK, navigate to your custom starter template, select the content folder, and click Select Folder to migrate it over. Now that you've migrated successfully, continue migrating any other assets that you want from this template. For me, that's all I want, so I'll close it out and head back to the starter template we are creating. Over in the content browser, you can see that the first-person folder structures have migrated exactly as they were in the other project. Opening these folders will reveal everything that was migrated over. Before you start organizing anything in this project, continue to import any other meshes, animations, and blueprints that you want in your starter template. If you want a vehicle default template, then follow the same procedures as we did with the first-person template. For this video, this is all I'm going to migrate over, so I'm good. The only additional character I'm going to do for this tutorial is a true first-person character, but I'll adapt that using the third-person character that's already here. First things first, let's go ahead and create a folder structure that makes sense to you. Remember, this is how it will migrate into your other projects, although it can be changed at any time, but it's good to have a standard structure that you use regularly. What I've done here is not that important. You don't need to copy it exactly. All I did was try to separate each type of character into their own folders, all animations in their own folder with subfolders for each skeleton type, mesh folders with separate subfolders for each skeleton, etc., etc. Now simply start grabbing all the original folders and files and moving them into their new folders. I had a little difficulty when I was moving things around. I didn't want the Quinn mannequin or any of the related animations or textures. All the mannequins is for prototyping, and I don't need more than one of them for testing, so it's unnecessary space. As I was deleting the various files of her, the editor crashed on me a couple times, so it's important to remember to save. Also, because of the crashes, it seemed to double up on some of the files for me, and not just for Quinn, but for Manny as well. So just make sure if this happens to you that you replace all references of the extra Manny files to the file you're keeping, and you should be okay. One other good habit to be in is to make sure that you right-click on the content folder and select Fix Up Redirectors in Folder. This will make sure any references to your files are properly pointing to the right location. When moving things around, the editor will create a temporary file that includes the original location of the file that will also tell them the location of the new folder. Fixing this up removes that temporary redirector file. Now that we have everything moved where we want it and all the original folders deleted, I want to create a player controller for each of the characters. For the true first person, I'm going to simply copy the third person character blueprint and rename it True First Person Character, then create a player controller for that as well. We'll deal with setting up the true first person later. Now that we have the controller blueprints, let's open up the first person character blueprint and the first person player controller. When you compile the blueprint, you may notice some errors that the input actions are missing. If these are actions and mappings you are planning on keeping, then head over to the project settings, input, and add any missing events. These events will not transfer straight over to a migrated project, so these mappings will need to be created for each project you migrate the characters to. Moving the code over is a pretty straightforward process. Because this is going from a character to a controller, there will need to be a few things we need to adjust, but it's not too difficult. If you weren't aware, the blueprints are just binary code. You can copy and paste it virtually anywhere and get a readable text back. Let's start with the first block of code in the character, which is the yaw and pitch input for the gamepad. Again, if you don't want gamepad controls in your starter template, then don't include it. If it's something you don't use, then you'll find yourself deleting it when you start a new project, and that's precisely what we are trying to avoid by creating this starter template. Copy it and then paste it into the player controller. Compiling the blueprint will show a couple of errors. First of all, we don't have the variable turn rate gamepad in the controller, so if you right-click on the variable node, you will get the option to create the variable with the same name. If you don't see this option, then try not to right-click over the name, but off to the far edge of the node. Once a variable is created, compile it and set its default value to 45, which is what the default was on the character. Next, you'll notice that the other error is on the add controller yaw and pitch inputs. This is because this function is part of the character class, which automatically gets the game's default player controller and runs the code on it. Since we are in the player controller, we just need to change these functions to add yaw and pitch input. Compiling now should show no more errors. Follow these steps and bring over the rest of the functions from the player character. Compiling the code again will reveal all the issues that we need to fix. Don't feel overwhelmed, these are really simple fixes. Let's start with the yaw and pitch inputs for the mouse. This is the same concept as with the gamepad, so just change the add input to use the same function as the gamepad events. The jump event and the movement inputs all suffer from the same problem, so fixing them will be fairly similar. For the jump event, right-click and add the node Get Player Character, then plug it into the target of both the jump functions. Next, in the movement inputs, right-click and get the node Get Controlled Pawn, then connect this to all the target inputs of each node. Lastly, head down and delete the Call on Use Item dispatch call from the primary action. We won't be doing anything special with this event, it can just be properly implemented in the end project. If you want to test out the function, you can set a print string so that you can confirm the action is working. For me, I'm not concerned about using touch control since mobile development is not a primary target in my development, so I will delete the touch controls. Head back to the player character blueprint and delete all the code there. Make sure to delete the variable and the event dispatcher as well. Now, let's test to make sure things are working properly. Go into your content drawer, and if you still have the game mode, then set it to use the first person character and the corresponding controller. If you don't have a game mode, then create one now, put it into a folder somewhere, and enable the project settings to use it. I've named mine GM_test. Game modes are another good thing to have in a starter template. If you create various game modes, such as a capture the flag or a team deathmatch, then you can save those game modes here and just migrate them out if or when you need them. Now that you've set the game mode, hit play and make sure everything is working as it should. When you're satisfied, exit the game. If everything is working, then good job. If not, don't worry, just go back and double check what you moved over. Ensure that you have the binding set up in the project settings and that your project is using your custom game mode. Next up is a third-person character. This is virtually the exact same thing as we just did for the first-person character, with only the movement inputs being a little different. Go ahead and move everything over to the third-person controller and fix everything like you did with the last one, and when you're done, I'll show you how to set up the movement inputs. Alright, now that you have everything moved over, let's take a look at the movement inputs. Right-click and get the function Get Controlled Pawn. Hook this output to both the movement inputs. Then, drag off the Get Controlled Pawn and find the function Get Control Rotation and make 2 copies of the function. Right-click on the return of the rotation function to split the struct. Now, right-click on the graph and get the function Get Forward Vector. Right-click on the input of this function and choose to split the struct pin, then plug the output into the top add movement function. Connect the yaw of the control rotation to the Get Forward Vector yaw input. For the right and the left event, again, split the output struct of the Get Control Rotation function. Right-click on the graph and get the function Get Right Vector. Like with the other one, split the input of the right vector function, except this time connect the roll to the roll and the yaw to the yaw. Then connect the output pin to the add movement function, and that's it. If everything else is fixed and you can compile without error, then make sure to go back and delete everything from the third-person character blueprint. Set the game mode to use a third-person character and the corresponding controller, then hit play and test it out again. If everything is working properly and you're satisfied with it, then exit the game. We're just about done. Open up your content drawer and open your true first-person character that we created earlier. To save a little bit of time, I've deleted the original controller we made for the true first person, and instead, I'm just going to copy the controller we just made for the third person character, name it PC_TrueFP, then move it into the proper folder. There's going to be a few changes with both the character and the player controller, but they should be pretty easy to do, so let's get started. Go ahead and open the TrueFP character and the TrueFP controller. First, in the TrueFP character, let's go ahead and delete all the default code in the event graph if you haven't done so already, as well as any variables that exist, such as the turn rate gamepad variable. Now head over to the viewport. Select the follow camera component and drag and drop it on top of the player mesh component. This should remove it from the camera boom. Select the camera boom and delete it. With the follow camera selected, go over to the detail panel and under the parent socket variable, click the folder icon, locate and select the head bone to parent the camera to the head bone of the player character. You'll see the camera jump out and start moving around, but don't worry, simply head over to the camera's transform variables in the details panel and reset the location to 0. Now we need to position the camera in a location and rotation that will suit our needs. For me, I'm going to set the location to X7 and Y12. For the rotation, set the X to -90 and leave the Z at +90. While we're still in the character blueprint, select the class defaults at the top of the screen and in the search bar of the details window, search for yaw. We want to enable the use controller rotation yaw or the camera will turn independent of the character. Now let's head over to the player controller and finish this thing up. Because we just duplicated the third person controller, most everything we need is already set up for us, but like what we did with the third person controller, we will need to make a slight modification to the movement inputs. We'll also need to add a function to the begin play, but we'll go over that in a minute. We could keep a couple things in this event, but let's just delete everything except the action event and the add movement input functions. Now, right-click in the graph and get a get control rotation function. Right-click again and get the make rotator function. Split the output of the control rotation function as well as the input of the make rotator function. All we need to do is plug the yaw together, then drag off the output of the make rotator and drop it on the graph, then find the function get forward vector. With that hooked up to the make rotator, connect the forward vector output to the world direction of the forward event. Plug the event's axis value directly into the scale value of the add movement input. Now, do the same thing, but this time add the get right vector function and plug its output into the right event's add movement input, and hook this axis value up as before. Lastly, add the function get controlled pawn and drag its return value to the target inputs of both add and movement inputs, and this function is done. Compile and save it, then start the game to see what we have. First thing you'll notice is the nauseating fact that the camera is moving way too much. Next, you'll notice that we can't look up or down. Exit out and head back into the player character. Select the follow camera, and in the detail setting, search for rotation and enable the use pawn control rotation. Go ahead and start the game again, and this time you should notice everything is better. Now look directly up and down. Depending on where you situated your camera on your character, you may have varying amounts of clipping into the player mesh. You could just continue to move the camera around until all this clipping is gone, but you'll soon find that isn't an ideal solution for varying reasons. Exit the game and head back into the True FP controller, and I'll show you what I did to fix this. In the event graph, add the begin play event if you deleted it earlier. Because we'll most likely add many more things to the begin play in a production project, I'm going to add a sequence node by holding the S key and clicking in the graph. Next, right-click and get the function Get Player Camera Manager. Drag off the output and find the Set View Pitch Min function. Drag off the Camera Manager again, and this time find the Set View Pitch Max function. If it's not obvious at this point, we're going to limit the amount the camera can move in the pitch direction, which is the up and down. To make this user-friendly, create a couple float variables and call them viewPitchMin and viewPitchMax. If your camera is in a different location than mine, play around with the different values to find what works best for you. For my setup, I will set the default min value to -70 and the max to 80. Hook these up to the appropriate set functions, ensure everything is hooked up to the execute, then head back into the game and check this out to see if your values work like you want. You should see that there isn't any more clipping. Don't restrict your pitch movement too much unless it's a game mechanic you desire. You want these settings just to the point where you aren't clipping any longer, but you can still see your feet. That's pretty much it. If you find yourself doing different things every time you start a new project, then add the functionality to this template design. Remember to keep things simple. Only add functions and events that you won't be deleting when you start your new projects. You can add any other character and controllers such as the RTS controller or other similar controllers. This project will be available to download for my patron level programmers and higher. I will work on this project and add other controllers and characters as needed and keep this downloadable to my patrons. If you're interested in supporting the channel, check the links in the description. One last thing I would like to do is explain the migration. It's a pretty straightforward process, but as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Epic likes to add extra things to some of your migrations. Let me show you what I mean. If I open my content drawer and select the third-person character, then right-click on it and in the Asset Actions, select Migrate. First thing you'll notice is the long list of control rig items. You don't need to migrate these, and in fact, you really can't. You get errors when you try to. Deselect the whole control folder. Next, it's going to try and double up the Manny skeleton. I'm not sure why, but it puts it into another folder structure that you didn't create in your project called Heroes. Deselect the Heroes folder to prevent this from migrating over. Now you'll notice it's trying to add another folder called Mannequins, and in this it's trying to give you Quinn. Even if I kept Quinn in my template here, I am not attempting to migrate it over, but Epic always tries to force this on you when migrating the Manny mesh. I'm assuming it does the opposite when trying to migrate the Quinn character. However, when migrating just the arms meshing the character, it doesn't force any extra meshes on you because there is only one skeletal mesh for that character. Deselect the Mannequins folder. Double check the rest of the migration to make sure nothing unwanted is going into the migration, but this should now be straight. If the rest looks good, select OK. Find the project you want to migrate this to, select this content folder, and migrate it over. You'll receive a confirmation that says some things were and some things weren't migrated over, but I think this is because of the control rig and the Quinn mannequin. But you'll notice you should have everything you intended to migrate in its proper place in your new project. Even though you didn't migrate any of the rig arrows and other designs, you'll notice that the rig looks just like it did in the original project. And that's it. Hopefully you found this video useful. If you have any questions, leave a comment below, or you can join the Discord and join in the conversation over there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.